panelist. There you are! It works!
Technology is what it is. Sorry about that,
Yeah,
everybody.
that's what I was going to say. Technology is great until it's not. So,
Great.
Perfect. Thank you for joining us.
No problem. Yeah, so I don't know how much Meg has shared about me. I'm letting her just share the presentation from her end, but I work for the City of Ottawa, and I also specifically focus on everything related to electric vehicles within that, sort of within my role. I also am an EV owner, so I've had an EV for the last 7 years. I recently did a road trip in my EV. It's a 700-kilometer round trip in a matter of a couple days. Great time. Maybe it would have been better if the weather was more wintry than I expected, but otherwise pretty great. And then I've also sort of been volunteering in support of the Electric Vehicle Council here in Ottawa to educate people about electric vehicles and share my experiences and hopefully get other people on board with the idea of an electric vehicle for themselves. So that's a little bit about me. I was going to let Meg just share the presentation, and I was going to go run through sort of a high-level overview of electric vehicles, what I see as sort of some opportunities related to that in tourism, and then as well when it comes to sort of funding was a big one that we often hear about. So I have some final slides near the end where we can talk about that in some more detail. So we can go to the next slide.
Okay, perfect. That's what I was going to say. Just let me know when you need me to change slides.
Great. So on just a brief outline, I've got some information about what electric vehicles are, what makes electric vehicles special, how quickly electric vehicles are being bought, not just here in Ontario, but also across Canada. Maybe as well speak to some of the American experience as well. Some benefits and opportunities that are expected with electric vehicle adoption, and then hopefully get some time set aside where we can get some questions from you guys and get an idea of what it is that you have questions about, and maybe have an open discussion near the end as well. Next slide there, Meg. So generally, what electric vehicles are vehicles that don't use gas. They have traditionally lower maintenance costs and are cheaper to run over their lifetime, which is part of the reason why a lot more people are interested in them, or they sort of make headlines every day. Most of the time, the other part of this being that you can actually charge these vehicles at home, so you never have to visit a gas station ever again. And they're very convenient if you can plug them in at home. They plug them in overnight and they're fully charged for the next morning. Not only can you charge these at home, but similar to how gas stations work, there are a lot of public charging stations available, and there's an increasing number of those as a result of both private industry interest as well as from government funding. And we also get this question a lot about, say, is this technology expensive? And it's actually not as expensive as many people think. There's over 20 different vehicle models available for less than the average new vehicle price today. So I have a couple of examples in the following slides of some of the sort of best sellers, I would say. But the biggest seller is this Tesla Model 3 that's here. CAA has made a lot of work to understand the vehicles, share knowledgeable information. And if you're looking for an unbiased sort of opinion on electric vehicles and what they mean, CAA does a pretty good job of explaining the technology, the models available, the incentive programs, and all that. So the Tesla Model 3 and the Tesla Model Y are the biggest sellers in Canada and North America more broadly. But on the following slide, I've got a couple of examples and their starting points for pricing. So on the next slide there, Meg, we've got what should be the Hyundai Kona, which is a very popular seller for not just a gas vehicle, but they also make an electric version. And that starting price of $46,000 is the starting price. But because they're electric vehicles, they also get a federal rebate of $5,000. So they're generally more affordable than that $46,000 you see. And as well on the right-hand side, we have the Bolt EUV, which starts around $42,000. And that's also eligible for the same kind of $5,000 incentive. They make relatively great family cars. I know 3 of my coworkers have the Kona and 2 of them have a Bolt EUV. Kind of work in a world where that's sort of the norm for how people get around our city, but those are kind of the more popular vehicles that I've seen. And on our next slide, we've got a couple of, say, larger vehicles, I would say, or more upscale vehicles. So the Volkswagen ID4 is a very, when I did my road trip into Quebec, that seemed to be everywhere, and it starts around $52,000. And then this new vehicle on the right is actually a 7-passenger SUV, so it's a very family-friendly, hauls everything. You can put roof racks on, it starts at $60,000. It's still eligible for that $5,000 rebate, and then it has over 500 kilometers of range, which is good enough for most people to get in and around town, as well as go further afield. So. That's just a couple of examples that are sort of the top sellers in Canada beyond the Tesla system, but um, I can share some more information afterwards about where you can learn more about all the other vehicles that are available. Can go to the next slide. And so what makes an electric vehicle special is there are a couple of things that come to mind, but the main thing being that they don't produce any tailpipe emissions. So you can operate these without producing any pollution. Ontario's electricity grid is relatively clean. If you charge them overnight, it's running basically on 100% nuclear power. So that's the opportunity presented there. The vehicles themselves are smoother to drive. They don't have any transmissions in them, so there's fewer parts that could fail. And they're also inherently safer. The architecture of the vehicle, or the way they're built, is that the frame of the vehicle and where the batteries are placed help increase how rigid that car is. And there's it protects the occupants inside better than a traditional vehicle. There's less opportunity for a rollover. And most EVs reach sort of I think in the top 10, but the top 10 safest vehicles on the road, I think 9 of them are electric vehicles. So it's another interesting consideration as well. CAA's put together sort of the life cycle cost of these vehicles, and you're saving roughly $3,000 a year just on fuel. But they've also done a comparison of gas vehicles to electric, and they show that even over, say, a 2-year or 3-year period, most electric vehicles will end up being cheaper than a gas car, or at least it takes that long for them to break even. And then any longer that vehicle's operating for, you're just saving compared to what a gas vehicle was. And because these vehicles don't have any fuel systems, and they also don't have any transmission components, the actual maintenance costs are significantly less. And because you don't have to go to the dealer to do your oil changes every 6,000, 7,000 kilometers, this saves you time, as well as the fact that the maintenance costs will be lower. And then finally, like I'd mentioned, there are rebates available at the federal level. So anytime somebody buys one of these electric vehicles, the $5,000 rebate is available to them. And they can use that $5,000 for their electric vehicle purchase in each calendar year. So if you want to buy a second one, you just have to wait another year, and you're still eligible for another $5,000 if you choose to buy a second electric vehicle next year. We could go to the next slide, maybe, Meg. Great. And so there's been a lot of headlines recently about how quickly electric vehicles are selling and whether or not they're slowing down. I have data this is from the Canadian government's registration data for vehicles. And roughly it's around, we're targeting around 185,000 vehicle sales in 2023, which is about 12% of all vehicle sales. 35,000 of those, of that number were being sold in Ontario. So it's not the vast majority of them, but there's still a pretty significant number, and that number seems to be increasing year over year. There are more battery electric vehicles sold last year than hybrid vehicles. So hybrid vehicles have been around for 20 years or 25 years, depending on, say, if you want to include the first generation Toyota Prius in that. But that gives you an idea of how popular these are and how quickly they're being adopted by drivers. So the electric technology is significantly better, I would say, compared to traditional hybrid, just because of the convenience of charging at home and the lower operating costs, but alongside the maintenance issues that I mentioned previously. And then that Tesla Model Y is actually the best-selling vehicle in Europe for 2023, not just for crossovers, not just for passenger cars, but best-selling vehicle overall. And their sales increased year over year by 84%. So year over year, they're growing at around, they're basically doubling every year. It may not continue to be that way as more electric vehicle models come online, but just from a perspective of how it compares to regular vehicle sales that say like a Honda Civic year over year doesn't increase at 100%. It's pretty significant growth that they're experiencing, at least in Europe, and it may not be the same here, but the fact that Tesla represents about, I'd say 65% of all the battery electric vehicle sales, it's still a pretty popular model here as well. Next slide. So given that this is a focus on, or you guys are working within the tourism space, I thought I'd point out a couple of things as it relates to tourism operation and electric vehicles. So people who drive electric vehicles are looking for places to charge. Generally, that's going to, they go to a couple of places to help find where these stations are, but putting a charging station at your place of business puts your business on a map for people who are electric vehicle drivers. They sort of rely on the fact that there could be a place for them to charge so that they aren't stuck, or maybe not stuck, but they aren't sort of lost in trying to either find where they're going or being worried about finding the next charger from where they started from. If they're visiting a place that they haven't visited before, it helps acquaint them to things that they're looking for on that trip. So that way you're able to better understand there are charging opportunities. I can recharge my car when I get there, and it can give me the charge and confidence I need to visit and go back to where I started my trip, or to continue on my trip to the next place I was going to visit. And then the other thing that comes from this is that EV drivers or electric vehicle drivers are more willing to spend money at businesses that cater to their needs. It's the same reason that people might choose to buy a more expensive product, because it better aligns with what their values are, whether that's social justice issues, like fair trade coffee is a big example, or if it's environmentally focused, in this case, such as electric vehicle drivers. They'll be more willing to pay potentially a higher price for stuff, or spend more time, or leave a review. They're just more likely in that sense to be a part of that. The charging stations themselves and the way they operate is it basically encourages people to spend more time at businesses. It's not many of these charging stations take around, like for the average charging station, let's say, if you were to offer that at your business, it would provide drivers with enough range for about 40 kilometers for every hour they're parked. The longer they're parked, obviously, and the further away they came from, the longer they might want to stay so that they can recharge their car and continue on their trip. So because of that, it's that incentive where if by offering this, that allows them to stay longer and potentially spend more time or spend more money, or have a better impression of your business. I think that's all part of how these stations could sort of support your business in that sense. And there's a couple of studies I could share afterwards if there's interest about how that works out. But generally, because you're spending more time there, you're looking to, say, enjoy more time at your restaurant, or do a second activity on top of the first one they were planning, something like that. That's sort of the idea behind it. And then because this is all new, by starting at a point now where there's interest, at least from the early adopters, it allows you to better understand where this is going to go in the future. So I always like to point out that Quebec has Canada's largest number of electric vehicle drivers, just on the number of vehicles registered there. Quebec is only about well, depending on where you are in Eastern Ontario, it could be an hour, it could be 2 hours from where you live now. But it's a great sort of intermediate step between, say, Montreal and Toronto and that whole corridor. If you have a business that's looking to tailor something towards those drivers who are traveling that route, offering electric vehicle charging is a great opportunity, I think, and it gets you into understanding, like, you can see it in real time, you can better understand what their needs are, and you can adapt it as well. And you can start small. So some of the stuff you could probably get going for around $5,000 as a maximum, but if you start small with just one station, you can see how it works. You can get some feedback from people. There's no reason you would need to put in like hundreds of thousands of dollars to make this work. So it's a small sort of investment you could even build in as part of another upgrade you might be doing to support your business as well. All of that is sort of available and should be considered, I think, as part of that. Next slide. So I've got a couple of examples of where charging stations have been put, and maybe might relate to some of the businesses or operations you're working with now. But um, this one here, the Big Apple, they've had a charging station installed since 2015. If anybody's driven the 401, you know where the Big Apple is. It's a giant sort of apple on the side of the highway. Um, and it's a place where people go and buy apple pies and apple pastries, and there's parks and there's a petting zoo, and that's something you could spend an hour, 2 hours, 2.5, whatever it is. Um, the station itself, these guys here that I've sort of put into the photo here, they actually operate a car review channel, and this was back in 2017 when electric vehicles were relatively new. But they actually stopped here, took some photos, put it in their YouTube video, talked about the experience. This is generally a positive one. And then that station has been sort of in operation for a while now. It's well known by sort of locals who come here and get their pastries for, say, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter. Just puts it on a map, and it's a positive thing that's shared in a sort of in a forum for people who are looking for places to stop and to visit as either a tourist or for a local itself. So that's one great example, I think, and sort of the long-standing nature of how that station's been used. Go to the next one. I don't know if anybody drinks Cowbell Brewing beer, but it's fantastic. But I also didn't know that they actually created sort of they call it a destination brewery. I don't know where that came from, but it's a great idea. That business itself is built on an idea of like land stewardship. So a lot of the stuff that they've done at that property has been around sustainable development, socially responsible initiatives. And they've put in, I think it's 5 charging stations. So it's not a massive investment, at least from the early days of this kind of stuff. But what they can do is it's not all beer. They can buy local products from the general store on site. They can walk the surrounding nature trails, which are, I think there's 25 acres or something that surrounds the property itself. And then they can also enjoy a meal at the restaurant as well. So anybody who's coming through the area, say they wanted to spend an hour, hour and a half, that charge could be enough to get them from, if you know where sort of Cowbell Brewing is, it's on sort of the sort of around the Goderich area, but that hour and a half charge could be enough to get them back to either Goderich, or they could go back to, say, London, Ontario, which is an hour and a half. It's a couple of different ways that they could do that, I guess, from that sense. And Meg, if we could just go to the last one we got for an example. This is one that's more established, I'd say, and it's really led by the 2 local utilities in British Columbia. But BC Hydro and FortisBC, they support network planning and charging infrastructure. So they do a lot of work around finding the best sites and upgrading infrastructure to make sure that it's available for these kinds of installations. But they also do a lot to co-brand this infrastructure so that any of the businesses that are sort of surrounding where they're planning to put this infrastructure are informed of where it's going, can promote it in equal ways, get the information to their potential customers, and share it as a marketing initiative. And this network's been expanding across BC at various rest stops, communities downtown, as well as business destinations as well. And there's a growing interest from charging companies to co-locate here. So originally, the only installation here was from BC Hydro, but there's been 2 other private partners that have also expanded in offering EV charging here as well. So if it starts small with just 1 operator, they've grown it to now having the opportunity to charge 10 vehicles at once instead of 2. So the market interest in having more charging opportunities and expanding the number of charging sites and sort of working together with businesses to make this happen is one of the trends we've seen in a lot of this infrastructure getting installed. So that's generally that's potentially the end state for where we're going, but in Ontario we're still early days. So it's interesting to see how far some provinces and some states have moved, but it's always great to see positive news stories like that. On the last slide, I've just got a couple of opportunities that might be of consideration for anybody in the tourism space, but um, Canada is looking to move to 100% of all new vehicles being sold to be electric by 2035. So that's, say, 10 years away. And because of that, it's going to be a gradual transition, but you'll start to see more and more electric vehicles on the road over time. And so currently, there's going to be a lot more of these electric vehicles in urban areas in Quebec, but because the people like to drive and visit places, they'll like to see more charging infrastructure placed in those regions in between those urban areas. So that's one opportunity that I think might be interesting for tourism operators in Eastern Ontario for sure. There was an original call for funding to make or to install charging infrastructure in Ontario. And there's likely going to be a second round, and that funding was a very attractive offering where they're going to provide 75% of all project costs to make this happen. And then so the rest of that 25% can come from a variety of different sources, whether it's your own operations, whether it's working in partnership with, say, an RTO9 as an example, or whether you want to work with your municipality or your local utility. There's a lot of different ways you could come up with that 25% to balance out that project. And then so that there's distributing that cost across multiple sources and identifying the priority this kind of infrastructure could play on economic developments and sustainable tourism. I think it's an easy sell, but I'm happy to share some examples of where that funding's gone and what discussions usually happen, or sharing the original funding application and what's typically put towards it. I can definitely include that as a future discussion. And then the last item on the opportunity side is collaboration amongst not just municipalities and tourism operators, but also in private businesses. So there's a couple of different opportunities from infrastructure providers who are looking to put more charging stations in more places. Tesla, as I mentioned, has not only do they sell vehicles, they also sell charging infrastructure. But they also have an infrastructure partner program so that if you're a business who's operating in a particular area, they're looking to have more infrastructure installed, you can reach out to them and say, I've got a business that's in your area that you're looking at. I think I'd be a good host for some of this charging infrastructure. And they could evaluate your site against where they're looking for and have a discussion and figure stuff out and how many charging stations they could install and that kind of thing. They've been pretty successful actually with the federal government in getting charging stations installed in national parks. And so I think there's over 100 national parks that have charging stations available all through that sort of Tesla initiative. So that's one I could point out, but there's lots of others, and the growing market for this, I'm sure there'll be lots more in the future as well. And then the other part of that is by working together or identifying partners early on, you can get a sense of who's interested in hosting this kind of thing and getting knowledge about what's required to make this happen. And that planning piece is really where a lot of the, say, costs or time constraints typically get sort of not exaggerated, but start to become a big part of why projects take some time to get developed. So the sooner you're able to get discussions going around understanding what this could mean and what the opportunity might be, the sooner you'll be able to sort of move forward with some of those project initiatives and also apply for funding, because a lot of the funding windows are quite small. So the more time you can spend planning the initiative, the less time consuming it's going to be to actually put forward an application. And I think that was pretty much everything I had. So I've left my email here. So if you wanted to jot it down, I'm pretty sure the presentation can be shared afterwards if you don't have a chance to not jot this down. But I thought I'd give some time and get some questions and answers from you guys. I think there's been a couple that have come through in the chat, so maybe you could start with those. But otherwise, if you have other questions, feel free to raise your hand and we can go through some details there.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks, Mitchell. We did have a question about sharing the presentation. If you're comfortable, we can put it in a PDF version and we can send it out to everybody, and we'll put it up on the website so that people can get the information they need.
Yep, that sounds good to me.
So Jules asks, what's the average charging time for a home receptacle? You might know because you're an owner of an electric
Yeah.
vehicle.
Yeah, so it depends. There's two different ways you can charge it at home. You can charge it on a standard like 120 outlet, the same that you would use for like a TV, a toaster, a microwave, those kinds of things. And if you're doing say 40 to 50 kilometers of daily driving, which is most of say urban Ontario, it might be slightly different in rural areas, but that overnight period between say 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. Would be enough to recharge a vehicle for that 40 to 50 kilometer round trip daily use. You can also install sort of a dryer or stove plug. And those dryer stove plugs have a higher voltage and higher amperage potential. And so with that, you can charge your vehicle in that same 40 to 50 kilometers could be about an hour or two, depending on how you're using your vehicle, obviously. That's sort of a rough idea. It depends obviously on which kind of vehicle and whether it's being done in winter or summer, but typically the infrastructure that gets installed by sort of public charging is going to be more to that say similar to a stove plug, where it's going to take maybe an hour to do the same 40 kilometers that it would take longer if you were charging at home on a 120.
Perfect. And then I have a question here from Greg that was asking if you have details on phase 2 of the funding. I'm assuming because it hasn't been announced yet, you're not sure. But what were kind of some of the parameters of phase 1, maybe if you can share that might help people gauge if they would be eligible if the same parameters come out for phase 2.
Yeah, so phase 1, the main goal out of phase 1 was to get a large the main focus, I think, for that was going to be around increasing the geographic distribution of where charging is found. The current way that infrastructure is typically installed is in large urban areas, and the focus of the first round of funding was distributing that instead to more rural or remote communities. So places that aren't along the 401 corridor, places that aren't, say, within an hour's drive of Toronto, those kinds of areas were prioritized, and cities or towns that had less than 120,000 people, I think, was sort of the cutoff, were counties and towns that were allowed to apply for that funding. So that big piece was around the geographic distribution, and I think given that there's a limited amount of charging infrastructure in Eastern Ontario, it makes Eastern Ontario businesses and townships more likely to receive funding in the future. But I think the opportunity around planning out who's interested, who wants to be a part of this, finding partners, getting discussions going with local utilities about how this is going to be planned out. That kind of initiative is where a lot of time could be saved, or at least preparing for the next round, which I would assume is going to be part of a future round of applications, but all depends on obviously how budgets get assigned. But I'd say there's a pretty good chance that there's going to be a second round of funding.
Perfect. And then I have a question here from Eric, who's just looking on your thoughts on e-bike charging stations.
Yeah, we get this a lot actually here in say more urban areas too. The infrastructure for e-bike charging isn't quite different in the sense of like where it should be installed, but the costs are going to be significantly less. So if you wanted to put in a car charging station, it could be say $5,000. But if you just wanted to put in some charging infrastructure for e-bikes, it's going to be significantly less. It's probably about $1,000 to $2,000, and you could get 4 or 5 bikes charging off of that. It's easier to do this inside, I would say, than outside, just from a weatherproofing perspective. But it doesn't require the high amperages or the high voltages, so it's going to be similar to like charging charging an e-bike battery will be similar to running a toaster, I guess, from that sense. So you can charge more e-bike batteries than you can charge vehicles, just on sort of the way that technology is set up. I don't know that there's any specific funding available for e-bike charging, but the cost, or if you're already going to do an infrastructure project for car charging, the added cost of doing e-bike charging is going to be significantly less in that sense.
Perfect. Now, Lori's asking if you can speak a bit more about marketing EV charging stations, or do the apps show where they are?
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways I've seen it done. Obviously, the different charging networks are one piece. You can advertise through there. I know Flow, as an example, does some outreach to their charging customers, and they get feedback from them about where they want charging stations to go, or do they know about charging in this area. So that's what that particular business does. But there's nothing preventing you from doing it yourself. Like all those groups that I mentioned there, they actively promote their stuff on either social media or on, say, their blog posts, or they're part of their own regional tourism groups as well. And they share their information about where vehicles can be charged as well. And it's really up to you. Like, I'm not a marketing expert, but the way I go about finding where my charting is looking at businesses on from tourism operation groups. I go on the different apps to see where charging infrastructure is. But the more sort of, I don't know if prolific's the right word, but the more promotion you can put behind the initiatives you're doing to support people in visiting your business, I think it's a good step to consider for sure.
Perfect. Lori's also wondering if the City of Ottawa has a limit on how many stations they're going to be putting in, based on the assumption that EV vehicles may cap out, let's say, 30% of the market, and if people start to transition to hydrogen-powered vehicles once the technology becomes available.
Yeah, I'd say that there's a certain amount that the city itself would put towards this kind of thing. We see there's an opportunity for private businesses to do a lot of this. And I think in that same vein, there's a lot of work that a private business, a tourism operator could get out of a private charging operator to get charging installed for a lesser cost. So I think that's one thing that relates between say a city's job and what a tourism operator might expect. But I think what we're moving towards is more, at least on the passenger vehicle side and say regular everyday people. I'd say electric vehicle technology is probably better suited to personal vehicles than hydrogen technology. And hydrogen technology might find its place in sort of like we look at it and say, if a vehicle can't stop and charge for hours at a time, like think snow plows or other specialty vehicles like that, that's where hydrogen technology probably makes more sense. But for vehicles that are being driven for 2 hours a day, like most personal vehicles at most, electric vehicle technology is going to be probably a better use case for that.
Perfect. And then Ilan, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name, is saying that fast level 3 chargers are expensive to install for small rural businesses, even with previous rebates. Is there rebates to buy or lease the fast mobile chargers to help travelers who are mainly traveling between towns?
Yeah, so that's where that funding from the Ontario government comes in, I think. What we've seen is there's a pretty big interest from local utility companies to own, operate, and maintain that infrastructure on behalf of the townships and counties. And so the main challenge we've seen is trying to find a good host site for where that infrastructure could be placed. The host wouldn't necessarily have to put up any capital to get that charging station installed. They could still benefit from that charging station the same way as I've mentioned, either through marketing it as an opportunity for EV drivers to stop and charge on their trip, or it could be something that's built into a business case for more people to spend more time there. But those costs are generally going to be something that would be borne by the utility company and not by a tourism operator. So I think there's opportunities to work with your local utility to get in touch with them and say, we'd like to put this infrastructure nearby, or we see there's an opportunity for this kind of thing. I think creating a list of interested sites is maybe a first step, and then having some sort of working group or maybe advocacy. But if there's multiple tourism operators who could see value in this kind of thing, and they could work together to work with the utility in identifying sites, that cuts down, I think, 80% of what the utility's workload would be for putting this infrastructure in. the considerations around, is there enough electricity to supply this kind of thing, is as I think readily available to them, or it wouldn't take much time for them to figure that out. It's trying to figure out who's interested and what the agreements might be in place, how we're going to get people to use this charging station. I think tourism operators are well set up to sort of represent or be good hosts for the infrastructure that gets installed. So
Perfect. And this kind of leads into Jules' other question, which is any plans for funding countryside charging stations, or if we're just not quite there yet. But I think you mentioned the provincial funding was kind of focusing on those rural communities to get the infrastructure, maybe not in between, like on a country road somewhere, but there might be opportunities in the smaller rural communities to put in those charging stations.
yeah, if I had my computer up and I could share my screen, I'd show you where the map has holes in it. But Eastern Ontario has basically just the 401 corridor and the 416 as sort of places where charging stations are currently found. So there's lots of opportunity, I'd say, for tourism operators to fill those gaps with charging stations that could be used by visitors who are visiting for various reasons. If they're spending an hour or two, that should be plenty of time to recharge their card to get them to their next stop. But when it comes to that provincial funding, that's one stream. The other stream where you can combine funding from both the provincial governments and any other streams where you already get funding from, the federal government has an infrastructure program as well. And that sort of adds there's additional money you can get from a federal program to offset even more of your project costs. And that is being launched, I want to say, they call it spring. I'm going to say it's May or June, where they're looking for people to submit applications for funding there. I think the role for a tourism operator in this case would be to work with your utility on an application that a utility would put forward for any of the interested groups in their territory. So if you're talking about, I think Kingston is on Frontenac Power or somebody. Whatever the local utility is, if you can reach out to them and say, we know there's going to be funding available, we think you're going to apply, or we think you should apply, and we have 2 or 3 businesses who are interested in putting charging stations in. We've had our local utility apply on our behalf. We've seen sort of around the GTA, a couple of local utilities apply on behalf of interested site hosts there. Those are the kinds of working relationships we've seen to get this infrastructure installed, and it reduces the amount of time that a private business might have to put towards getting this infrastructure installed and putting in applications for funding and administering that. And that shouldn't be the focus for a lot of tourism groups. They should focus on their tourism operations. But if they're looking for funding, I think working with your utility is a great place to start.
Perfect. And I actually see that we have Alan in the chat, it looks like he's from Flow. So I just put his contact information there as well.
I think I know Alan there. Yeah.
So that you can reach out if anyone's interested in potentially working with Flow there. Reach out. And he's also mentioned that he's happy to share info about the current and future provincial and federal rebate programs. So feel free to reach out to Alan as well. Thank you, Alan, for popping in the chat.
They are great sources of information, I'd say. They will help you along that process for sure.
Fabulous. And we have another question that what would be the suggested cost for installation of a 2-car installation station?
Okay. It depends on a lot of things. I could give you a cost for what it cost me to put one in at my house, and you could start with something as simple as that. Say if you have if your building is right next to your parking lot, it wouldn't really cost you as much, mostly because you wouldn't have to dig up any parking lot facilities. You wouldn't have to trench anything. You wouldn't have to install a concrete base. You could wall mount it to the outside of your business, maybe, as a potential option. So like a home installation is somewhere between, say, $1,000 and $2,000 on the low end, and maybe $4,000, $5,000 on the high end. And for a private business to do something like this, you could probably expect a $5,000 sort of as an easy estimate. But if you're trying to bring power from your building and trench 200 meters and put in a whole new electrical service, like the cost could go up. I would suggest trying to keep your installations as simple as possible and as low cost as possible, and working with a charging station company like Flow or your local utility. They could give you pretty good estimate of what it would cost. But as I said, if you can get 75% of that project covered through provincial funding or 50% covered by federal funding, those kinds of opportunities really help make this an easier product to move forward with, I would say.
Perfect. That's what I was gonna say. The big cost would probably come with updating service. If you don't already have something that could support a charging station, probably the upgrading of the service and running it to your parking lot might be the larger fee that you're looking at.
Yeah, the closer you can get it to where you have power, the better, because it reduces costs there and materials. If you can repurpose, say your building was built in 1960 when we still had incandescent lights and inefficient refrigerators and everything, you probably have some spare capacity already. If you're a newer business, I'm not sure how that works out in your case, but maybe you were built with 200 or 400 amp service and you can use more of the available capacity to support EV charging. There's lots of opportunities. You do energy management. You can go through that process, figure out what works best. There's a lot of different solutions that can help make this a lot cheaper. It just depends on which is the right solution for you.
Perfect. Is there any ongoing maintenance or monthly costs for charging?
Depends. If you were to put in a low-cost charging station that you wanted to offer as a free amenity for people to visit and use, you probably could get, like I installed one at my house, and I would suggest something like that would work well for a lot of businesses. I haven't done anything on maintenance since I installed it 2.5 years ago. If you were to do a more expensive product that has the capabilities of charging fees for use, then you have to pay a network provider for the credit card transaction process there, as well as a network fee, which then makes it a little bit more expensive, but it's not, if you're getting good use out of it, it makes it worthwhile and you're collecting revenue as well. If you're simply looking to offer this as an amenity, the simpler the solution, the better. If you can offer it for free, that's going to reduce your costs as well. And really, just people are looking for a place where they can recharge. They don't necessarily need it to be complicated. So, yeah, you can have maintenance be basically free, which is what mine looks like. The maintenance on a lot of these is relatively affordable, at least on the infrastructure that would be for similar to what you would install at home.
Perfect. And do you have a map where you can kind of view where the opportunities might arise between charging stations?
Let's see if I can do this from my phone.
It's a test.
Can I share my screen on my phone? Let's see. Give me 1 second. See if I can do this.
And I'll stop sharing so that
share.
it might make it easier for you.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, I could show you what I'm looking at on my screen, maybe. Screen broadcast. Start broadcast. Okay.
Fingers
I don't know
crossed.
if this is working. Let's
Oh,
find out.
It is working. I see myself.
So, yeah, so I'm using PlugShare, which shows you where charging stations are found. I currently have it filtered to only look at fast charging stations. So Kemptville is sort of where a lot of existing charging stations can be found. If you go further south, you'll get to Prescott. And like I said, along the 401, there's a lot. And then into Gananoque and into Kingston, there's a lot of level 3s. But if we're talking like RTO 9, this is sort of, at least in my understanding, this is Belleville, right? So you're talking up in this area, there's nothing there. If you're talking into, say, Perth, there's still nothing. If you're going even further east, it's still just the 401 corridor, so you're missing Winchester and Finch and all those other places. And if you were to focus instead on the lower charging power, that option, I'm going to get rid of, actually, no, that was just still work. There's a couple more options. So this one is installed at a restaurant, which is fine. It's sort of a good use case. They offer theirs for free, seemingly. There's a couple more in Kempville for sure. And then there's only this one in Brockville, which is at a car dealership, which is probably not where people would like to stop on their trip. I think the same one, this is the same idea in Gananoque. This is also a car dealership. And then you get into Kingston and there's a lot more.
Holy smokes, look at Kingston.
Yeah. So like outside of major cities, there's basically nothing. I mean, Westport has one at their municipal parking lot and Perth has one in their municipal parking lot. But there's a lot of gaps between major cities where charging stations aren't, at least in Eastern Ontario.
Sure. Mitchell, can you show us possibly like up towards the Quebec border?
Yeah. So when you cross over the Quebec border, you'll notice like this. So this is Cornwall down here. And then you keep going along the 401, you reach Quebec. And then if you go to Montreal, you should see basically it doesn't even load all the stations. Like if I zoom in on actual Montreal, you get more and more stations, and you keep zooming in, you get more and more. Montreal is filled with charging stations. And the same could be said for like further north, you go to Repentigny, there's a lot there. If you keep going further north into Quebec City, this is Trois-Rivières, we could stop in Trois-Rivières. There's a lot of those charging stations just there. And their rural areas are built out as well. So like Lac aux Sables is a very sort of not resort heavy, but still like remote in the sense that it's pretty far away from most major cities. They've got some there. Saint Ramon has some. If you go further, so Quebec City, there's a lot there. If you go sort of east of Quebec City, there's still some even in sort of the outskirts and rural areas out here as well. So Quebec's got a much more built out network for sure when it comes to where the infrastructure is. That could be Eastern Ontario if you want it to be. But it's just it's presenting it as like this is where Quebec has built out their infrastructure, and there's like that's where they're at today with I think it's probably 15% of new vehicle sales are electric in Quebec versus Ontario it's closer to 9%. So in a couple of years we could potentially have a demand for that kind of infrastructure in Ontario as well. So those are things that sort of I would keep in mind when you're thinking about whether this is the kind of thing that is worth investing in or not.
Perfect. And then I have another question from Lori that you mentioned that they're installing them in national parks. Is there a case or has there been a discussion about potentially installing them in provincial parks?
So provincial parks have, well, some provincial parks have charging stations as well. The provincial government's done a similar thing. The one that comes to mind is Sandbanks. So Sandbanks has some level 2 charging stations there as well, but not as many and not as universal across all provincial parks. So I think which one was I saying? Sandbanks has I think 2 charging stations. The national parks have nearly a dozen. So like Gross Moor National Park, which is in Newfoundland, has I think it's 10 or 12 charging stations there. It's a pretty remote place, but they still found power and put in a lot. Jasper National Park has a bunch as well, sort of the larger ones. Those are kinds of the ones that I see as the opportunity places, where there's sort of lots of charging for seemingly a small number of people, but they built it out with the expectation that in a couple of years, the additional capacity need is going to be there, and building it all now when there's funding available is sort of part of their process, at least for that. But on the provincial side, I think they're slowly working towards having charging stations at all of them, but we're just not there yet for every single one.
Perfect. And then one last question from Lucy, who's wondering why Quebec is so much further ahead than Ontario with the charging stations and the EVs.
Yeah, there's a couple of things. Quebec has a provincial subsidy for, or I guess it's a provincial purchase incentive for electric vehicles on top of the federal one. So they get an additional, I think it's $7,000 for electric vehicles in Quebec when they buy them. So that's one piece. They also have incentives for home charging station installation, so you can get some of that cost covered for installing one at home. They have one local utility instead of 67 in Ontario, so they only have to work with one sort of charging provider to get some of this infrastructure installed. And it's also identified as a government priority. So they've put hundreds of millions of dollars into expanding the grid, offering a public charging network, working with private companies to co-locate charging in the same spots. So they've built out the business case on sort of the demand as well as the supply, which is a good initiative. But simply put, they've put a lot more money into it than we have. But in the future, when say when there's more electric vehicles just based on say lower cost vehicles or in more market segments, or more people are looking to get an EV or whatever it might be, that market that Quebec currently has will be here at some point. It's just maybe not as visible where we're currently at. Sometimes change takes time, and sometimes things happen sooner than you think. So looking at things the way things are now may not be the best way of looking at it, but seeing where other places are now and where we're going to be, I think this is one thing to keep in mind.
Perfect. Well, this was an awesome discussion today. I see that we're almost at 11 o'clock. Do we have time for one more question? Do we think we want to do one more question?
I've got nothing after this, so if there's another question, feel free to let me know.
Okay, I have one more question here. They work for Go FM, which is mostly a French radio station in Eastern Ontario. If they were to talk to their clients about getting this, they would like to exchange publicity on the charging machine if this is possible. Like, is it possible to do, and I'm trying to remember what it's called, but when you offer one thing and you get something in return for doing the thing. It's not necessarily a monetary exchange, but it's of value. Is that something that they could possibly do?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it from a radio perspective. Like our local radio station does, I think it's a weekly piece on like businesses that are doing sustainable work, whether it's energy efficiency, renewable energy, lower waste, those kinds of things. There's I think a similar business case, or not a business case, but paid promotion or paid marketing or sponsorships, any of those opportunities and sharing stories or promoting stories of that nature, either from a media perspective or a private business perspective, I think those are definitely things that I think that's where we're at. There's a lot of interest in that kind of thing. I could see there being an opportunity to address any of those concerns that come from this kind of new change that's happening. It can be like a frontline piece of like businesses that are making a shift towards this or making it part of their business operations going forward. I think it's a pretty good opportunity to share those stories, to make a pitch out of it, create a marketing initiative from that. Yeah, there's definitely that kind of thing for sure.
Perfect. And then just the map that you're using, what app were you using to look at the different
So the app I'm using is called PlugShare. PlugShare itself has also has a web version, which I'll try to share in the chat. And it's a crowdsourced piece of information that allows people who are EV drivers to share locations of new charging stations, to take photos and share where charging stations are found, to tell people whether charging stations are available or being used or how long they're going to be there, so that people know that they can unplug somebody else once they're fully charged. That kind of user feedback helps make charging stations and charging usage a lot better, I think. And it's been sort of our de facto map of where charging stations are. It's a pretty reliable sort of, if they're on PlugShare, they're definitely there. Sometimes the stations that are available on a public network may not show up, and therefore they're not always visible. But PlugShare is crowdsourced so that say those free stations that don't have a public network can be shared as well. So that's, and I think it's got over, I don't know exactly how many downloads, but it's pretty extensive across Canada and the United States. So it's got charging stations throughout for sure.
Perfect.
And I think I shared it in the chat there. So if you want
Yes,
to check it out, you can
I
check
see
out
it.
the web
Great.
version, or you can download the app and you can learn more about it from there.
Perfect. Well, we're at 11:02, so we're gonna let everybody go. But thank you so much, Mitchell. This was great discussion. I normally we have very quiet audience, so I'm very impressed by all the discussion and all the questions. So thank you everybody for your engagement, and thank you, Mitchell, for coming and presenting to us despite technology trying to get us down.
Yeah.
Really appreciate your presentation and the information that you're sharing. Again, this is all going to be put on the RTO9 website. I hope everyone jotted down Mitchell's email address. If you have any interest in potentially exploring this a little bit more, feel free to reach out. And also feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to get you connected. If you didn't write down Mitchell's email, it's okay. I can do an email introduction for you guys. But thank you so much, Mitchell, for presenting to us today. Really appreciate all the information, and thank you everybody for joining us. I'll let you get back to your days. And again, we'll follow up with the recording, the presentation, and the quick survey. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, but enjoy the rest of your day.